This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. Be inspired by the voices of visionaries, changemakers, and ordinary, extraordinary people who do what they do, all for the love of learning.
This is For the Love of Learning, Voices of the Alternative Education Movement. I'm Lainey Liberty, and this is episode number 12. The theme of tonight's episode is called Trailblazers of the Alternative Education Movement. Tonight's show is going to be a fascinating conversation featuring three trailblazers who are each innovative leaders within the alternative education movement. All three of our panelists have challenged the status quo, defining what education should look like, and have created programs, schools, and opportunities where there was none before. I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of our panelists, and then we'll start the conversation. Although these introductions are brief, we have more information about each of our panelists on the show notes page located at consciousconsumernetwork.tv, and look for the show notes page for episode number 12. There you will find more extensive information about their backgrounds, links to each of their projects and websites. So let's jump right in. First, let's meet Matt. Matt is currently a school administrator in a California private school, a visionary leader, and a national spokesperson for the alternative school movement. With his experiences as a teacher and administrator in public and private schools, national professional development trainer, and adjunct professor of education, Matthew is currently developing an alternative school within a school in order to showcase the necessity of alternative philosophies to traditional education. Welcome, Matt. We're so happy you're here with us tonight.
Thanks, Lainey. Pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. And next, let's meet Victor. Victor is the founder and president of the board of Realm Charter Schools. Victor is the visionary behind this new concept school located in Berkeley, California. Victor is the former principal of Berkeley Technology Academy, or BTEC for short, a continuation high school where he raised the API score 270 points and earned the school its first accreditation through the Western Association of Schools and Colleges during his 6-year tenure there. Victor is passionate about improving the public education system and has 2 children currently attending public schools in Berkeley. Victor, I'm so happy we've reconnected after all of these years, and welcome to the show tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited and honored to be here.
And finally, let's meet our third panelist, Thomas. Thomas has contributed to the creation of the Agile Learning Centers in New York, a new concept approach to learning. The Learning Centers were founded in 2013, informed by 5 years of work exploring alternative education models, leading-edge business practices, and positive psychology. The Agile Learning Centers' root principles can be found in technology, collaboration, purpose, culture, and creativity. Welcome, Thomas, to the show. We're so thrilled you're able to join us tonight.
Thanks for having me. Excited to jump in and get it going.
You're welcome. Well, let's do just that. Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about your background and what led you down the path into alternative education?
Well, I guess, it depends on how far you want to go back, but to keep it relatively brief, I guess for me, it in a sense started when I was in college, studying psychology, and reading a lot of other things on my own about history and religion and philosophy and science and all kinds of things. And I guess really wanting to try to find some sort of social change work that felt meaningful to me, that incorporated my skills and my natural gifts, but also seemed like it was authentically engaged in social change rather than just kind of a band-aid or you know, an attempt to kind of heal something at the surface. And just through close relationships and exploring things on my own, I discovered concepts about democratic schooling and self-directed learning, and just kind of a whole other approach to viewing children that really inspired me to just kind of head down this path of learning about alternative education models and education in general. I never really wanted to be a teacher until, and I still don't really. I really am interested in this work because of it feels like social change at the root to me is changing the way we view children, and looking at them as the world uncreated rather than people or things that need to be trained to fit into the world as it already exists. So that's, you know, for me, it kind of happened in personal discovery around the time I was in college, and then has just kind of been a you know, domino effect from there.
That's really outside of the box sort of thinking. So as you were trying to find your own path, you were led down the path to discovering what learning looked like. Was that learning for you, or were you more connected to youth and children as your inspiration?
I think a little bit of both. I always felt comfortable around kids and doing things with kids growing up. You know, as I got older, and like, you know, naturally had a natural affection for kids, but also, and currently have come to discover it's not necessarily my generative sweet spot to be working with kids day to day all the time. But so there was definitely some of that, but there's also a strong pull of it being about myself, and I say that to this day, that a lot of the work that I do is you know, in a sense selfish, because I want to be living a life where I'm living in community with people who are viewing kids this way and are raising kids this way and are educating and thinking this way. And I didn't want to be a part of kind of what seemed like a bunch of fallacies and just kind of like, you know, turning a blind eye to things that seemed ridiculous to me about the world in general. So my motivation to get into the work is, you know, I guess it depends on how you define altruism and selfishness and all those terms, but I think it's a combination of wanting to find a thing that really engaged me passionately in whatever, and that has to have meaning and purpose. And so for me, that meant like being a part of something that really felt like it was affecting change in the world, and this struck that chord with me.
Yeah, wonderful. And we'll jump back over to you in a little bit and find out about the project that you created. But thank you so much for sharing your background. Thank you, Thomas. Mm-hmm. Let's jump on over to Victor. Victor, could you share with us a little bit about your background and what led you down the path to doing what you do currently in the Bay Area in California?
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for having me. It's always great to be in conversation with others that are doing this much needed work. You know, unfortunately for me, my trajectory was just like that of many Latino boys and African-American boys in urban schools. I went to 6 high schools before I had completed my junior year of high school. I was kicked out of 2 school districts and eventually kicked out of the last school that I attended in a very violent way, in a very kind of, you know, insulting way, and that was much of what my educational experience was like, both in middle school and in high school. So to this day, I still don't have a high school diploma, and like many boys in my neighborhood, sadly and unfortunately, that was the norm. So, you know, for many years, I just began to accept that as my trajectory, like everyone else's in my neighborhood. It wasn't only through a number of friends in my neighborhood that were arrested and having some unfortunate circumstances that I began to examine my life and what my true purpose was and what I was capable of. I stumbled back into higher learning through the community colleges, completely and entirely I don't know, by an act of God, really. I was doing a workout on a track, and I ran into a track coach who invited me to attend the community college down in San Diego. But it was completely a chance meeting. And I found out at the time that I was both, intellectually and even just physically and physiologically unprepared for school. I couldn't sit for longer than 30 minutes without, bouncing off the walls. And I certainly didn't know how to study or prepare myself for anything of rigor. So it was a tough time. And I was in my mid-20s at that point. So as I got back into school and part of my work studying community college was to go out and meet other kids. And of course, like the counselor at the community college who found out about my story was sending me into like the worst neighborhoods down in San Diego. He's like, "Yeah, you're just like them. Why don't you go talk to those kids?" Which I enjoyed, frankly, and actually did feel really comfortable being in. And so in working with young folks at that time, I came to realize really quickly that I was ill-equipped to work with them as well. I mean, they were asking me questions about college and life after high school, and I didn't know the first thing to do really in terms of how to help them. Certainly not technically, like writing essays and applying for financial aid and things like that. So my venture into public ed, into alternative ed, was really maybe more of a calling than it was purposeful or highly intellectual or thoughtful. I stumbled into teaching kind of reluctantly and became a classroom teacher. And then for about 10 years, I served as a principal. All of that was in continuation schools and alternative ed. So I'd always worked in juvenile halls and county jails and continuation schools in some really tough neighborhoods. So I don't know, it was just, it was kind of like the right match at the right time. And I was probably doing as much teaching as I was learning from the kids. And I was helping them heal as much as they were helping me heal at the same time. And so it was definitely a give and take situation all along the way. And that's how it's been for about the last 15 years.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Victor. And we're going to actually ask you a little bit later on about some of the projects that you're working on. I actually have some insight because I remember as you were developing some of these projects, because you were actually one of my clients when I worked in graphic design before. I had a branding agency. So I'm familiar with part of the thought process, which is why I completely thought of you when we were putting together this panel. So I look forward to diving into that deeper. But first, let's jump on over to Matt. And Matt, I'm really interested in hearing about your background and what led you down the path into exploring alternative education, and even from the point of view where you're sitting in a private school, and yet you're doing some pretty incredible things as well. So go ahead and share with us how you got your start.
Well, my background growing up, I grew up in a decent, middle class neighborhood, and figured out very early on how to play the school game, as a young man, and was always able to get good grades, whether or not I learned the thing or not. I kind of knew how the game worked, but I had the kind of almost the stereotypical enjoyable high school experience. And so I think that was what kind of put in my head, hey, I want to get into education, and that's kind of where that started. Went on to college and got my degree and came out and wanted to take some time just to kind of have some fun, and was doing some things, was competing in mixed martial arts, and was having some side jobs on the side, and just sort of having some fun before I figured I'd dive into my career, which I had envisioned as going back to maybe the high school that I grew up with, or somewhere in a similar area, and coaching some sports, and just kind of living that stereotypical dream that I had thought of. So my wife and I were in the Bay Area at the time, and we both ended up going to work for Stanford University, and we were out there for a while, and I was doing some training out there and some corporate training, and was doing various things for the controllers department out there, where I was teaching the students in one aspect, I was teaching the faculty in another aspect, and then staff members in another aspect. And I kept, of course, kind of coming back to that. I think I still want to go into teaching at some way. That was a way for me to kind of be in the mix of it. But I still have this dream, this vision of going into that traditional high school, And as I started talking, especially working with those kids at Stanford, I mean, everybody knows Stanford University. Everybody knows you're an intelligent human being to get into Stanford University. But I'm sitting and having conversations with these kids every day, and I'm like, you know what? Having these conversations, if we were going to talk about quantum physics, I mean, these kids are going to blow me off the map. But everything else, it was blowing my mind. I'm like, what? Some of these kids, just basic life skills, basic conversational skills, basic, how do I pay for this? How do I do that? It just started. It started sort of changing my view on. Well, what are we doing in school? If I got these kids that are coming out that are brilliant here, but they're having a hard time functioning in society over here too. So it was kind of started the, kind of the brewing in my head. And my wife and I realized that we were going to be, into our 80s before we ever probably purchased anything in the Bay Area as far as a home. So we decided to move to Sacramento area, a little more affordable. And I figured, this is the time. We're going to go there. We're going to buy a house, and this is where I'm going to get in and kind of live that teaching dream. So got there, started going into, got my credential and went into the public schools, and was teaching in a Title I area and kind of around the Stockton area. And it was a natural fit for me, but it was a natural fit for me with the kids. And it was kind of what I envisioned as far as my relationship with the kids. But what I hadn't been prepared for was the structure, was some of the political pressure, was some of the focus that was taking place. And I'm not saying this takes place at every single public school necessarily, but it was at the school, that I was at, the focus on, I don't worry so much about the kid, worry about this test that's coming up. And it was very much a test-driven culture. I know that's kind of the stereotype that you hear, but that's really what I was involved in. So I decided to go get my administrative credential through University of Pacific and just kind of see if I could get a little more into the insides and outs of how schools are supposed to run. And it was really through that process. I've been teaching in the public schools for a few years and getting that credential where I said, man, I'm not a huge fan of the way this system is set up. I see what's being effective with my kids, and I've got kids from rough areas, but you know what? They've got some things they care about. And if I set up my classroom as more of a, where I'm this kind of more of a Socratic guide, I'm not as worried about the grades. I'm worried about what drives you. What is this kid good at? This kid's never gotten great grades, but this kid is an absolute genius. What drives this kid? And so that was always my focus, but it was getting me in trouble at the school level. Like, hey, this isn't how we want you to teach. So I figured, then I'm going to make the move into private education, because this, in my mind, I'm sitting here going, okay, well, this is what's going to afford me to have that opportunity to not have to worry about this and to really focus on the kids. And the interesting I found is as I go into private education, as wonderful as it is, and as wonderful it is not to have some of the handcuffs that are around in the public institutions, a lot of times we model things based on the same that same kind of traditional model, and now I'm in a different demographic. I'm actually on the complete polar opposite end of the demographic I started out in public schools, but I've got the same things. I'm having the same issues. I'm doing, I'm going from kids that are living with their family members who are involved in gangs and they're selling drugs. And now I'm over here where there's kids, their parents are famous and have all kinds of money, and the problems are the same and the kids are the same. And I'm still struggling with, well, how do I, this kid just school doesn't work for him. He's an absolute genius. How do I draw that out of him? How do I still make him understand how much value he has, so I see a lot of these same struggles. So, I was always kind of battling that. And then it was just through, kind of like Thomas was saying, through some of my own research, and I'm a serial researcher and reader, and especially when it comes to people becoming the best they can be, and whether that's, physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever it is, finding that what is the best I can be. And as I'm doing that, I come across John Taylor Gatto, I come across the works of John Holt. I come across I came across Sudbury Valley School, and I'm going, whoa, I came across Summerhill, and I start finding all of these things, and I'm going, holy cow, but I'm seeing what it's producing, and I'm going, all right, well, where is the disconnect? What is that? And so that was really kind of the catalyst for me, just going, okay, man, I need to kind of dive in and really see what is kind of this ideal that I can shoot for, and how do I incorporate that into what we're doing here. So it's, at which that organically has spawned off into about 1 billion different things that, we could take the entire show to talk about, but that's kind of where I'm at now with with about 100 different projects on the horizon.
So you still find yourself in a formal institution. It's a private school, yet I know you through social media. I know you as the education dude, as somebody who is active about the alternative education movement in terms of sharing, ideas and articles and so forth. So you're very, very passionate and active about that. How do you express those particular passions within the school system itself that you're currently employed?
It's a good question. It doesn't come without its pushback from a lot of different levels, from other administrators, from other schools, from parents. At the school that I'm at, they're saying, I don't think you believe in the vision of what this school is doing. And I'm trying to tell them, I'm trying to just help change the vision. I believe in their kids, and I'm trying to help change the vision, at the school that I'm at. So really there's kind of a combination of things. I do work with a lot of schools in the Sacramento area, and what I do when I go into those schools, public, private, whatever, is I'm trying to teach them how to incorporate some of these alternative practices in their school, whether it's a school within a school model to kind of, convince them, hey, let's have a test run and see how this comes out. Whether it's kind of building a bridge so they take a look at things. So I work with a little bit with Larry Rosenstock of High Tech High down in San Diego, and really they've kind of, they're in this, it's a charter school, but they've developed this really just a project-based learning model that they don't focus on standardization of anything, and they've got this tight-knit community. And then what it produces is still, the kids that if they've got to take their standardized test, they still go out there and they dominate that. So I try to see if I can start building these bridges for some of our public and private institutions, just to start changing the paradigm a little bit. I'm not so naive to think I'm going to go in there and change every school, by spending a day with the staff. But if I can start to get them to see, a little bit of that shift to kind of just change their paradigm a little bit, it ends up, I think, making a difference, and I end up kind of slowly making these transitions. And that's really what I've done at the school that I'm at now, is kind of creating these small little school within a school, and like, hey, you know what, this student is struggling, but let me showcase what this kid is capable of doing. And I've got a small group of students that I'll work with, and we'll put together these projects based around things that they want to do. It's completely self-driven. And then I come back and I show all of their teachers and say, look at this, look at what this child just did. And they're going, holy cow, this child's never done well in school. I'm like, well, exactly. That's what we're trying to show you. So it's small things like that end up changing the paradigm. And, I think that resonates. I think that resonates with everybody. I think everybody has that experience of those kids who they go, oh my gosh, this kid is so smart. I just don't understand why they're not doing well in this class. I think that resonates. I think people all have those people that they remember. And I did a keynote presentation for a university here in Northern California in October. And so I had a room full of teachers and administrators from the area. And, really in essence, the whole keynote was about them doing their job, incorrectly. And I'm like, I got to say what I got to say. I think you're focusing on some of the wrong things. And so I kind of threw this stuff out there. And at the end, it was a standing ovation. It was a bunch of them going, yeah, you know what? You're absolutely right. This resonates. This is more intuitive. These kind of concepts are more child focused, and why aren't we doing that? And, so I think it's about raising the awareness of that and kind of slowly shifting the paradigm. And then when possible, creating all new paradigms as well. There's also a movement out here to completely develop an alternative school out here. And so that's what I'm working on as well. So like I said, have my hands in a whole lot of things, some big, some small, but all focused on changing that paradigm.
Awesome. And everybody who's listening to this can feel your passion. We can hear it, we can feel it. And so that's really a great place to be coming from. And when we come back to you, I want you to actually share some of your projects. But first, before we do that, let's jump back over to Thomas. Thomas, I'm so thrilled you're here. You and I were in contact maybe 2-3 years ago when we first started our project. And personally, my son and I were at a crossroads. We were looking for more community. And so it was the first time that we had absolutely considered changing our lifestyle from a mobile traveling lifestyle to going to an actual school. And when I read all about what you had created at the Agile Learning Centers, I fell off my chair. It was just perfect. I got it. I'd love for you to share with our audience, Thomas, what the Agile Learning Centers are and how they function, and anything else you'd like for us to know about this project.
Sure. Well, the welcome was really nice. I have to admit there is a part of it that's not totally true. When you mentioned, or I guess you're introducing all of us as people who have blazed trails where there were none before. I kind of winced at that because I definitely have, the work I'm doing was a path was kind of laid for it, and lots of people have helped me along the way. So I feel like I'm in a very I've found the kind of role that works well for me and my gifts. But I worked with a free school startup in Manhattan for 4 years before this project, and learned a ton of stuff from that experience, and a lot of that experience informed what we're doing now. That was huge, and there's tons of people who put a lot of amazing energy into that project. So yeah, I mean, and Agile Learning Centers, was an idea that kind of came originally from a friend and a parent of a student who was at the free school, who I had kind of been kicking ideas around with about what it would look like to upgrade the free school model to the 21st century. There is just a seeming gap between the narrative that the free school was kind of living in, and one that was actually going to reach people today. And so Arthur Brock, who that parent, kind of kickstarted this concept, in my mind at least. And then when the free school looked like it was going to close, we made it, kept it alive, and he kind of came in and piloted some of those initial ideas that we have been discussing. And I spent that year while he was doing that, just really learning a lot about education technology and agile software development, agile management, and things that are going on in kind of leading edge business practices that have a lot of crossover and a lot of strong comparison to what's valuable and what's effective about self-directed learning and intentional communities and that kind of thing. So I spent that year kind of really educating myself, and then at the end of the year decided to jump into this full force and take on the project. Arthur's kind of has a lot of larger software projects himself that he's been working on, and so this wasn't something that he wanted to do full time. So we actually launched the Agile Learning Center project through another project that Arthur had been involved with, called Emerging Leader Labs, which was basically a kind of pop-up 8-week residential social change incubator program. So I went there with my friend Ryan, who works at the school here in New York, and a couple other people, Eric Bear, who I work with right now around network stuff, and Arthur, and we were at this 8-week program where we kind of created an Agile Learning Center for ourselves in a lot of ways, and figured out what that would look like by living it out ourselves. And so that was a hugely important experience for me, because with the free school there wasn't really any training for that, and there wasn't really any kind of sense of how we were going to train ourselves for that. So when you take away the curriculum, you put kids in a room and adults in a room, and you take away curriculum. You say, okay, you're free to do whatever you want. Well, something forms within that vacuum, and so you have to be very clear about what it is you want to fill that space with. And that's a huge thing that we're focused on with this project, is creating an intentional culture, and culture as kind of the vehicle for which learning and community and collaboration take place. So getting to experience creating that for 8 weeks together while working on kind of launching the project was extremely informative for a lot of what we've done so far. So we kind of just restarted the community in New York with 2 facilitators and 6 kids in September of 2013, and slowly started getting the idea out there more and more to people. And my now wife, which happened very quickly in this past year, visited the school in the fall, and had just started a democratic preschool under that pretense in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so she was kind of, doing the same thing that I had seen happen a lot of times of, I want to do this, but I don't really know what it looks like. And so I was able to kind of convince her to, help me fulfill one of the kind of initial visions of the ALC project, was to create a network of learning communities that were using the model, and to create a really strong community of facilitators who are the ones, enacting in the model and running the schools. Because something I really experienced in alternative ed in the past 5 or 6 years has been, the disappointment between how much action potential there is for people who want to start schools like this, and how little they're actually working together and collaborating. We go to the Aero conference, or we'll go to this, weekend meetup, or we'll do this or that and get really excited for a couple of days. And then everyone just kind of goes back to like fighting against the prevailing system. And so it was really important that we created community around the people doing this work, so that we could expand it and have, a lot of close connections among those people. So within the first year, we were able to kind of create that network by partnering with the Mosaic School, with Nancy's school, and quickly started supporting 2 other homeschool co-ops. And then what we did was basically took that model that we had at Emerging Leader Labs and kind of shrunk it down and focused it on Agile Learning Centers. And last summer we did our first, facilitator, what we call ALF Summer, which is like an incubator for the model. And so that actually kind of helped us create that network, and solidify it and create that facilitator community, which has gotten really strong and is about to double or triple in size again this summer. So I'll pause there. I feel like that's plenty for now.
No, thank you for sharing that. And actually, I really appreciate how humble you are. For those of the viewers that don't know, that are not familiar with what Agile philosophy is, could you share a little bit about that? Because I know Agile programming, for example, from, I come from the tech world, I come from, the .com world, and this was part of the new age of, movement through the technology world. And I think it's important to have a grasp of what that is, so we understand how the education is modeled.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, basically, there's a huge parallel between the way software used to be created in companies, or it still is in large companies and hierarchical companies, and the way education works, versus what Agile is trying to do in software, and what democratic, self-directed, blah blah blah, student-led education is about. Software companies basically realized that the technology, the rate of change was happening too fast for them to have software be built in like a 2-year plan, where the managers come up with the big plan and they pass it from one section of the company to the other, and no one's communicating, and there's this hierarchy, like basically like a traditional corporation is structured. They realized that those walls had to be broken down, and new patterns and processes had to be created to build software effectively. So unfortunately, like a lot of social change in our world, it came from not necessarily like, oh, human, this would be better for human beings. They're learning that, but it was really kind of like, how can we build better software and have better companies? And I think there's a lot happening in certain business practices too, where people are realizing, like with, companies like Semco and Netflix, and, there's a lot of company culture out there that's changing to recognize, like, hey, we can actually trust our employees. We can actually, like, let people decide how much time they need off, and let them work collaboratively together, and let them, spend time doing whatever they choose to do to drive innovation and those kind of things. So anyway, Agile is, it's about doing things in a quick iterative cycle, and about having teams of people that have different specialties working together and communicating. It's about having coaches rather than bosses. It's about all those kinds of principles that cross over. And so there are companies who are really doing it, and I've been going to some meetups. I've gone to a lot in New York, and went to one in Charlotte, and the difference is pretty striking. But there are companies who are really doing this stuff and are really radically reorganizing the way they structure a company. And then there are other companies that are just kind of faking it because it's a fad. So that's, for me, Agile is kind of, there's a lot to learn from it, but it's also kind of a Trojan horse in that it's a different conversation for people to say, like, this is the way the world is changing. These are the skills that innovative workplaces are looking for right now. And this is how we're educating and organizing, kids school and learning and living. So that's a much more effective sell, I think, than some previous attempts at kind of bringing these ideas to new communities and new people.
Well, you touch on community and collaboration, which I really think is the key, and culture to Agile. We used it in our design firm, and even though it wasn't designed to be applied in that manner, in that form, we used it. We used that kind of philosophy, and it's all of those things: culture, community, and creativity. I think it's a great approach for education as well.
Yeah, I guess I want you to move on to I want to hear more about Victor's stuff. So the last thing I'll say on Agile, I think that there's a thing called Agile Manifesto, and one of the concepts that I think is widely important in that is people over process. And so it's really about saying, like, to be Agile is to look at the people in your community or your workplace or your school first, and to see what is the value that already intrinsically exists in these people, and how can we tap into it, and how can we create amazing results with the people as they are. You start with the people, and you pull the value out of them together, rather than looking at the people as this thing that you have to push some sort of product on, or some sort of standard on, or some sort of agenda on. And so those are the two kind of paradigm changes that Agile represents, as a pulling rather than a pushing. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do with self-directed learning communities.
Love it. Thank you. And Thomas, we have time to hear everybody, so I really want to make sure you feel like you're heard, because I think everybody has so many interesting things to share on this panel. So yes, let's follow Thomas's suggestion and jump over to Victor. Victor, I'm dying for you to share with everybody the programs that you've developed, and if you want to talk a little bit about BTech, that's great. But I'm really interested in your current project as well. So please share.
Yeah, well, thanks for the setup, Thomas. Our synonym for Agile is a student-centered learning model, which is exactly as you described it, which is building a school, in our case, around the needs of the students, the needs of the community, and beginning with all of the skills and assets and strengths that they bring, and basically helping to connect the dots. I do want to say something, and not for the sake of being controversial at all among this group, but as I'm listening to both Thomas and Matt talk about alternative ed, unfortunately, in the world that I've been living in for like the last almost 20 years, alternative ed, where I've been, is a pejorative by a long shot. You mentioned that in alternative ed and people cringe, in Oakland and San Francisco. I was in Boston, as you know, before I came out to Berkeley. I was working in Dorchester. These are schools where, the African American population doesn't exceed, 30%, like in Berkeley, and yet, they represent 90% of the kids in continuation schools. Or in Oakland, where, African American and Latinos represent, no more than 50% of the population as a single group, but make up 100% of the population in continuation schools or alternative ed. And I think it was maybe Thomas that mentioned the importance or the significance of drawing on best practices from all of the communities that are identified as alternative ed, because as there are some very prolific transformative learning models in the models that both Matt and Thomas described, a continuation school in East Oakland could benefit from that. And similarly, there's some great teaching that does take place in alternative schools that I've been in that other models could learn from. And unfortunately, we don't have that synergistic or connectivity that's really important in sharing best practices, unfortunately. And I don't know, I feel like I've been talking too long, but I will say that that's probably was some of the underlying factors that led to building the charter school. I'm not a charter proponent. I'm not pro charter or anti something else. I simply wanted to build a school that, as I was mentioning earlier, wasn't associated with criminal elements or dropout kids and that whole thing. So I presented actually an alternative to the continuation school as a small school to my then superintendent. And they said, absolutely not. They didn't want to do anything different for those kids. And they were very intentional about using that word. And so, I drafted out a very lengthy proposal for a different program because in a very wealthy and intellectually, a community with a lot of intellectual capital, you still had, large percentage of kids that were not graduating or not prepared for college or life beyond high school. And so I felt that I could do more intellectually. And again, I pitched it as an idea, kind of a small school within their existing schools, and they wouldn't go for it. So maybe it was part vendetta, I don't know, but I decided to pursue the charter school route just as a way to have more autonomy and to take on the challenge myself. And so against all odds, really, because at the time, well, even currently, there are no other charter schools in Berkeley. So I've opened the school on my own. We're 700 kids now on 2 campuses. Got about 50 teachers. I mean, it's a pretty big project now that, it's us. I mean, there are no corporate money. There's no uniforms. There's no big endowment. There's no family I can call if I can't make payroll. I mean, we got to figure all that out internally. So, but all that was motivated exactly based on the premise that Thomas was mentioning, which is that kids come with so much talent and so much resources and really need a place to nurture that. And I felt like that wasn't being offered in Berkeley, and I wanted to do that.
So can you share with us some of the biggest challenges that you've had to face as you've created this school?
Sure. Well, we serve about, almost 80% of our kids qualify for free and reduced lunch. And right off the bat, what that means is that I cannot rely on just state and federal dollars to run our program. So the entire back end of this program was really difficult for me to learn, because as a school teacher and then as a site-based principal, I was managing the school district's budget, but I wasn't responsible for creating that budget. And I certainly wasn't responsible for how you have to negotiate finances and cash and manage cash. But when you want to run an alternative program, and when you want to reach a broad group of kids in our case, who need an alternative place but can't afford to contribute anything financially, that's quite a difficult landmine to navigate. And because our narrative isn't around socializing these kids, you won't find anything in our mission or vision or programmatic that says that, you know, we're packaging these kids for the corporate world, or we're not socializing them to be good citizens. It's been difficult to get funding. We were turned down by the Walton Foundation, which is just one step removed from the Walmarts of America, which was probably a blessing in disguise, but that was a lot of money. And in fact, I haven't received any funding from any, not even regional funders, to say nothing for national funders. So I've had to be very entrepreneurial in spirit in terms of how we generate additional revenue. So that's been one of the biggest challenges. So the whole idea is that if we can be more solvent and be a strong business behind our school, and if I hire the right teachers, then we give them the freedom to really connect with kids, to work with kids and families and with curricula in a way that really doesn't limit what they can do. So my job is to keep bringing in resources so that their universe just stays as big as possible.
Beautiful, beautiful. Did you have to overcome any challenges with public opinion about your vision, about what you're doing? Is that something you could talk about?
Yeah, like I mentioned, you know, in the East Bay in Berkeley, and I think, Matt, you said you're from the area, you know that. Before we even opened, a neighbor, we were doing a recruitment fair. So at this point, we hadn't even admitted any kids to the school yet. And this is in Berkeley. I know some people think that Berkeley is really liberal and highly astute, but we were in Berkeley. We had a bunch of families that were in the building that we did a pop-up demo class. We did some robotics and some other things. And there were a bunch of kids just playing with stuff in the building. And a neighbor walked in and poked her head in and said, "Why are all these kids here in this neighborhood, and are they juvenile delinquents? And if I was opening up a school for juvenile delinquents?" So yeah, the perception, and maybe that's because of my connectivity to the continuation school before I opened, but the perception is with many charter schools in the East Bay that we're working with kids that are just one step away from juvenile hall. I mean, that's, I think, the stereotype. So so we've had to battle that all along. And I mentioned to you offline before we went on air, but you know, my daughter attends a school. Several people from that work at the school, their children attend the school. So we drink the Kool-Aid also. Everybody's on board. It's a really beautiful place to be in. And the work we're doing is, you know, is really thoughtful, and I'm really honored to be a part of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and I hear that too. I hear that commitment in your voice as well. I want to actually ask the same question to Matt. Matt, can you share some of the challenges that you've faced as you are advocating? I mean, you know, I don't want to say reform, but alternatives. I'll just leave it there. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And reform's not too strong a word. Revolution's not too strong of a word. I mean, you know, what I love about what both of these gentlemen are doing, they're in vastly different demographics, they're dealing with vastly different challenges, and they're going about it in different ways. But the reality is they're focusing on the kids, and they're believing in the kids that they are working with. And you know, that is my biggest thing. That's what I am an advocate for the brilliance in all of us, and I truly believe that. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be in this. And you know, not to sidetrack too much, but my father worked in the prisons in California for 30 years, and he would come home, and some of the conversations that we had were just about the absolute genius that he was seeing with some of these young men, and they've grown up in these environments, and they were obviously at one time or another made some poor decisions, but he was just enamored by the intelligence that was there, you know, and he kind of instilled that in me, that, you know, the reality is everybody's got a specific type of genius, and our job as educators is to find that and cultivate it, to light it on fire, and let them go change the world and kind of live their heroic journey. So that's really what I'm an advocate for, no matter what that ends up looking like. And so I think the challenge where I'm at currently, I was in the Bay Area for a while, and when I was teaching, initially in the public schools, was in the Central Valley in the Stockton area, and it was that's again rough area, very similar to some of the things Victor's talking about. But now I'm in Stepfordville. I'm in the area where the kids aren't hurting. They're not hurting for anything financially. They're not. The parents are home. There is a lot of money. Those things are there, but with that, the expectation is that every single one of those kids will get straight A's. The expectation is every single school will every single school will look like that traditional school they all grew up in middle to upper class America, and that's the expectation, is that the kids aren't going to have to try too hard. We'll give them their straight A's, and then they can spend the rest of their days going out and doing their activities, or going on their vacations, or doing, it's just this. And then, everybody lives happily ever after. When the kid graduates from high school, they go to Stanford or Harvard or wherever else they want to go. There's kind of this misconception, and then that's going to mean they've had this great education. So I think where I get a lot of pushback, I know where I get a lot of pushback is by saying, man, this isn't necessarily my idea of something better. You guys have all the things in the world. So how do we make your life meaningful? How do we give back? How do we teach you how to actually grow as an individual, so that, if someday you're not getting everything handed to you, you know how to go out and change the world and make the world a better place because you're in it. So it's an interesting thing to see all these kids who've had so much handed to them, but they're broken in so many ways, and there's no personal thought, and they really have no vision on the horizon other than what the next thing is that's going to be handed to them. So me coming in and saying, hey, you know what, I'm going to challenge you a little bit. We're going to make it look like this, or I think this student doesn't fit the model, but that's okay. Here, we're going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to change things up, switch things up a little bit. Anytime I think challenging the status quo where I am, it causes a rift if it doesn't look like that traditional thing. So, those are the challenges that I know we'll continue to face.
Well, it sounds to me like everybody on this panel has mentioned the learner, and that's actually good news, because you're not talking about it from the point of view of the district, of the rules, the structure. And so I'm really, really pleased to hear that everybody's coming at it from that perspective. So thank you for sharing that. Let's jump over to Thomas. And Thomas, I want to ask you the same question. Could you share with us some of the challenges that you may have experienced as you and your team were putting the Agile Learning Centers into place?
Well, I would say, funding in general. We're the model, the Agile Learning Center model. I love hearing about both of Victor and Matt's projects of school within a school, or at least Victor trying to make that happen in a previous attempt, and now doing a charter school in general. What we're trying to do is create a model that doesn't, that is continually changing and evolving based on the people practicing and using it. But and that's part of its agile nature, is that we want to be refreshing it constantly and iterating, like the major tools and practices that we use, so that they're always relevant. And that, we're not just saying, some guy 100 years ago wrote this book and you should build schools like he said to do it for the next 100 years, but that's a different context. So we've started with, the independent private school, a very small private school in New York, where we've had to do that we've had to do, sliding scale tuition to try to make it as accessible and sustainable as possible. And also wanting to see that model get applied in other contexts. So we've attracted some homeschool co-ops that are using it. We're going to have a startup in Oahu in Hawaii that's probably going to launch as an after-school program. There's K-12 schools. I'd love to see, a school within a school using the model. I'd love to see charter schools trying it. The idea is that it could be applied in lots of places, and that we want to connect people who are doing this work and want to collaborate and play together in lots of different ways. So in New York, as we started up, the challenge was obviously just being able to attract enough people who can pay tuition that sustains the school, while also attracting people who want it but can pay only very little tuition. Doing it on a very thin budget and fundraising and that kind of stuff is just always necessary from the get-go. And so, yeah, I mean, for me, the big challenge is hearing, stories like Victor's, really inspired by that and wanting to make the communities that I'm a part of accessible to all kinds of people, and also financially sustainable outside of the government and outside of the compulsory school system, because I guess I'm still cynical about being able to actually operate the way I authentically want to within that. So that's a huge challenge, is to be able to do it the way you want to do it, and also be sustainable and also be accessible. So that's the juggling act, I think, as we look at each of the communities that we're a part of starting. At least the other work of connecting people and building a network is a different kind of work, but that's challenging as well, but something I really enjoy doing as well. So
I totally resonate with what you're saying. I mean, those are the biggest challenges that we face, even doing our temporary learning communities. So I hear you. This is such a fascinating panel, and I'm so inspired by each one of you. We're going to take a quick break now. I think it's a seven-minute break. We're going to watch a video, and we'll be back with you right after the break is over to continue this conversation. So we're out.
School was intended on this continent to be, as it had been in northern Germany, a fifth column into the burgeoning libertarian condition, where disenfranchised and oppressed groups were clamoring for some kind of seat at the bargaining table. School was to be a surgical incision into which the class-based management theories of England were to be inserted to interdict the liberty traditions. England's multi-layered social class is simply a modern-day representation of Julius Caesar's advice that when you're overwhelmed by the enemy, you divide them and conquer them that way by setting them against each other. The method was to be by infiltration into the minds of children, out of sight of their parents. The well-read here won't be shocked. Theorists from Plato to Rousseau to Frederick of Prussia knew and taught explicitly that if children could be kept childish beyond its term in nature, if they could be cloistered in a society of children without any real responsibility except obedience, if their inner lives could be attenuated by removing the insights of history, literature, philosophy, economics, religion, if the imminence of death and the certainty of pain and loss can be removed from daily consciousness, if the profound reflections on one's own death could be replaced with the trivializing emotions of greed, envy, jealousy, and fear, young people would grow older, but they would never grow up, and a great enduring problem of supervision would be solved. For who can argue against the truth that childish and childlike people are far easier to manage than critically trained, self-reliant ones? And now you're ready to hear the 6 purposes of modern schooling taken directly from Dr. Inglis's book. The first function of schooling is adjustive. Schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. That's fixed habits of reaction. Notice that this precludes critical judgment completely. Notice, too, that requiring obedience to stupid orders is a much better test of function 1 than following sensible orders ever could be. You don't know whether people are reflexively obedient unless they'll march right off the cliff. Second is the diagnostic function. School is to determine each student's proper social role, logging the evidence mathematically and anecdotally on cumulative records. You probably thought that the kid or parents or neighbors or the region, circumstances. No, school is to determine your proper social role, and they're to fix you in that role mathematically on their cumulative records. Next comes the sorting function. School sorts children by training individuals only so far as their likely destination in the social machine, not one step beyond. Keep in mind, you're not listening to John Gatto. You're listening to the man for whom the honor lecture in education at Harvard is named. The fourth function is conformity. As much as possible, kids are to be made alike. Whatever the background they come from, they're to be made alike. This is not done from any passion for egalitarian ideals, but so that their future behavior will be mathematically predictable in service to market research and government research. Next comes the hygienic function. This one's my favorite. This has nothing to do with individual health, but it has a lot to do with the health of the race, at least as Inglis or Darwin or his first cousin Galton saw it. Hygiene is a polite way of saying that school is expected to accelerate natural selection by tagging the unfit so clearly. That's what all those little humiliations from first grade on, that's what all the posted list of ranked grades are about. So clearly that the unfit will drop from the reproduction sweepstakes, either in despair or because their likely mates will have accepted the school's judgment of them as terminally inferior. And last comes a fancy Latin word, the propaedeutic function. That's a fancy word meaning that a small fraction of lucky kids will quietly be taught how to take over management of this continuing project. Guardians of a population deliberately dumbed down and rendered childlike in order that government and economic life can be managed with a minimum of hassle. It's that low-down, nitty-gritty, common purpose. Not Marx's grand warfare between classes and greedy captains of industry. It's simply so that management will have a minimum of hassles.
Yeah, so we hope that you enjoyed that video. That video to me is a really powerful message. And I really want to switch gears a little bit with this panel and focus on the meaning of education. What, you know, we're all doing alternative education in our own ways, and we're affecting other people. But I really want to ask this panel, what does education mean to them? And I want to first jump over to Thomas and ask you that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a pretty deep question. It's almost synonymous with, what is the meaning of life in a sense, because assuming you aren't thinking simply within the narrow confines of, the role of education is to prepare you for life as an adult or something. That's one very small sliver of what education can and should be about. But I think it's really more of a side effect, a positive side effect of a good education. But I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't try to answer it universally. I think that's part of the problem, is probably trying to answer it universally. Having a society that values people being able to answer that question for themselves is probably pretty important. But for me, how I would answer it would be that, the meaning of life is to make meaning. And I think education is really about making, purpose and, personal purpose for each individual, for them to have the ability to experience their own life, to explore as a kid, and to be supported in that exploration, and to learn through failure, and to be loved, and to be accepted for who they are and what they bring to the table, and to be able to figure out, how they can engage themselves meaningfully in the world, in their community, and in their family, if that's their social construct or whatever, So I think what's really frustrating to me is that in this debate about education, especially in, with all the information that, whether it's your Facebook or Twitter feed or the news sites you read or the blogs you follow, so much of the conversation about education is about that little sliver of like preparing people for life as an adult. And to me, it's frustrating that concepts like love aren't involved in the question of what is education about, or, just the idea of a whole person, that, as human beings, we are so much more than our function in society, or what we can productively contribute to consumer goods, So, yeah, I don't know. It's a very big question, I think.
Yeah, well, you took on that very, very eloquently, so I appreciate that. I know it's a total loaded question, but one of the things that we haven't really addressed is, I mean, just like the John Taylor Gatto video that we just saw, it really talks about how education is institutionalized, and that becomes a paradigm of thinking that we all somehow agree to, and it takes the power away from the learner. And I like that everybody on this panel is very learner-centric. Does anybody else want to take a stab at defining what education really, how you would define education, and if you need to add learning to it as well?
I think Thomas really nailed it when, he said it's kind of synonymous to what is the meaning of life. When I think of education as opposed to schooling, I think education is, to me, it's synonymous with just being awake. Whatever you're doing in your daily life, you are learning. When you're having a conversation on the subway with somebody, you're learning. When you're, hearing somebody, who's having an argument about this, or somebody who's having a discussion about this, or you go to the store and engage somebody in the transaction. education to me is synonymous with just being awake and living your life. I don't think you can necessarily separate the two. And you know, I think the more you separate it and try to compartmentalize it, then you get, you know, the more you know, more traditional you know, schooling kind of model. So I think it's, you know, one and the same with just living your life. And really the purpose for me, you know, and I believe, you know, the same for the gentleman, and everybody's going to go about it their different ways, is, you know, again, it's like we've been talking about the whole time, is this learner-centric kind of thing. So it's going to be developing each individual to their utmost potential in every imaginable way, you know. And I know that's this kind of grand esoteric kind of concept, but you know, it's really, and Victor kind of said earlier, it's making, you know, the universe as big as possible for these people. And I think the more we can make the specific universe for each child we work with as big as possible, and say, here, you know, and I'm a man of faith, and I believe, you know, we're designed in a specific way, and each of us a little differently. And it's like, hey, who is the person you were designed to be? And then trying to provide that person with all the opportunities in the world to maximize, you know, who they could be, you know. And I think that ends up being obviously a grand undertaking, and it's a lifelong journey, and we as educators get to play a part of that, and whatever our relationship to that student may be. But I think that's the ultimate thing, is unlocking doors for people to write their own kind of personal heroic journey, and allowing them to make a world, you know, a better place for them having been there. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah, you know, I'd like to add, and if this is a little redundant, but, you know, it's also a place where a number of kids still need to learn to read and write and think critically, and based on where they come from, to be able to do so at a very high level. And the complexity in that very simple and obvious statement is that it's delivered in a way that doesn't come at a cost to who they are culturally, ethnically, linguistically, the history they may have in living in more than one country, perhaps. And so that's the challenge. And for many, unfortunately, some of the very basics of what schools should provide are sometimes dangled out to many kids as an either or, right? So you leave yourself at the door if you're going to walk in and get what's in this book. And you must digest this book the way I'm going to tell you to digest it. Or you must craft this essay the way that I tell you to. So for many, it's come at a very high expense. So without stating the obvious, but underscoring that it still doesn't happen at a high level for many, is that education is also fundamentally a critical place to prepare kids to continue their learning, in some cases to be prepared to learn and then to continue their learning. And though it sounds really obvious and simple, unfortunately, it's just not happening in a way that allows kids to be transformed by what they're learning, and certainly to feel like they can transform the very places that they live in. And so that's really, for me, the challenge, is that these very basic things that we sometimes take for granted, it's easy right now to get caught up in some of the other things that are really ancillary. We hear words like STEM and maker and all of this other stuff. But at a very basic level, I would love to be able to see our young kids with a great deal of joy pick up a text, feel like they have the skill set to digest that text and be critical with it, be in dialogue with it, be able to compare themselves and their histories to it, see themselves as part of this narrative that they're reading that seems so unfamiliar to them. And so, again, without oversimplifying it, to me, that's what education is about.
Yeah, I would just like echo a lot of that from Victor. A big part of what I talk about with Agile Learning Centers when I talk to parents and talk to people about it is the idea of, we want to support kids in being able to be people who say, this is what I want to create in the world, or this is what I want to create in my life, or this is what I want to create in my community, and be able to deliver on that and be able to make that happen, and to feel empowered to do that. And I think that that's more powerful than having any kind of, than making learning look like it's happening so adults can feel good about what they're seeing. That's more important than any amount of information or particular knowledge or general smattering of, subject matter. If you can say, like, this is what I want to do, create, or learn for myself, and be able to do it, then you can create real change and real, you're a powerful person. And I think, to Victor's point, it's really key that whether it's a homeschooling family or a charter school of 700 people, that the adults that are facilitating that learning environment are free to look at, or are freed up to look at the kids for who they are, and their background, their culture, their learning style, all of who they are, the whole piece, so that they can actually act from that place of, how can I support this person and being empowered on that fundamental level of being able to understand who they are, understand the world, and to act, have the ability to act and make change in the ways that they want to, and feel like they're not just moseying around through society trying to fit into the options that they have, but that they see the world as possibility instead.
I think that's a really good point. I want to ask this panel, what role does passion play in learning?
So again, that can go in so many directions, man. That can be such a deep thing. I agree that there's some foundational things. There are some basic things that we need to have. Victor is speaking about that very eloquently. That you have to provide some of those basics in order to bridge that gap until you can sit and digest that text and have dialogue with it, and you've got to have some of those basics there. I think that's one of the advantages of giving the basics to the younger kids, is that they're excited about digesting that. But the reality is, passion, as we get older, I think, as we get older, it's more and more the only way we learn. The only reason we're even having this conversation is because all of us in our adult lives, regardless of our backgrounds, this became something we were passionate about. This became something we wanted to dive in and take a look. And passion is what fuels, passion is what's going to fuel growth. All of us could easily have just stood by and kind of, do what we're doing. But it's a passion to want something greater, passion to want something bigger that fuels us continuing to learn and continuing to question, hey, is there something better, out there? And I know for me that, since leaving school, my learning curve has grown exponentially in really only a few different areas, but those are the areas that, I could sit and talk all day about. So, I think, it's almost, it's almost silly to say it, but I think passion is the fuel.
Yeah. For me, that's synonymous with relevance, perhaps. And we I think do a great job at our school of providing a really provocative context and relevant curricula for our kids to then allow them to, kind of explode with the passion that they come with. So, so passion is important in that sense, that when kids are given work that is contextualized in things that they can make meaning to and connect to their own communities, then the passion is definitely palpable. But that's not to be confused with dumbing down curriculum or making things always contextualize, and that's something that we struggle with at our own site. There's also a great beauty in struggle, in having a tough time making meaning with something that's unfamiliar. Being a little, I was thinking as Thomas was talking about the significance of education, and education has a role in connecting communities, right? And including, and especially when those communities are unfamiliar to us, sometimes in direct opposition to us. And that's also a place where you find a great deal of passion. And so as I mentioned, in our chat room, Realm is built on 3 core principles. Love is the first one. Grit is the next, and action is the final one. Well, it's not that they're sequential, but in every one of those areas, if you're going to demonstrate a high level of efficacy, then we need to be able to tap into the young folks and their passion, the passion that they come to the classroom with. I know that's also a really frightening thing for some teachers, which is probably another conversation around teacher readiness, preparedness, and how they're prepared in schools of ed. And that's certainly not a question that they're confronted with traditionally in schools of ed. But again, that's probably another conversation.
Yeah, kudos to making love an explicit, explicitly part of your philosophy or whatever. I feel like that's great to have that just like out there, that and to have something that's visible for people to always come back to in your communities. I can definitely relate to what Matt said about, I felt like I learned not to learn in school growing up, and like learning new things was almost just like it always, it's kind of like like when a friend just says like, hey, you got to check out this record, it's so good, and you're like, yeah, whatever, like I need to like discover that record on my own in my own time when I decide the moment's right. That's an experience that I have about being told that this thing you should do this thing or you'll like this thing. So I've definitely, like Matt, have learned a lot more on my own after being out of school and being able to pursue the things that I'm passionate about. But I also think that I had to create space for myself to explore and kind of fumble around first before that happened. And I think it's something that we really are trying to keep a healthy, balance of in the work that we're doing is, and I think it's important for, for people working with kids to recognize that, at first might just come curiosity, and giving kids the space to explore their curiosities without expectation and without, the need for them to deliver a particular kind of result. But to be able to just explore the world, because without the space to do that, they might not actually discover those passions as authentically. And sometimes if we're so focused on like, come on, what are you passionate about? What are you passionate about? Like get passionate, it can kind of feel suffocating for the kid to be like, oh, I'm supposed to be passionate about something, and they will be if they are loved, and if they're seen for who they are, and if they're seen for someone that's valuable for just being, and I think that with time and with love, those passions start coming out of them, and then it's really exciting for them, and it's really exciting for obviously everyone who's holding for that person's development. But so I think spaciousness is really important too in that conversation about passion.
Yeah, I like that. And I like what you're talking about as far as you got the spaciousness, but you're talking about that supportive community as well. And, providing that support, and part of what I'm talking on Friday, part of what I'm speaking about is the fact that, everybody within a supportive environment and given that space and given that love and given that, the reality of, hey man, you are valued for exactly who you are. And you are amazing the way you are, man. People will grow and start leaning towards and finding those passions and figuring out, saying, okay, I'm loved for who I am. So now I'm supported. So now what do I want to do? And that kind of sets the fire for them wanting to change the world. So I think that's a huge piece. And that's what I love about what Victor's doing. Cause I imagine a lot of those kids too are coming from a place where they don't have conviction that I'm worthwhile just the way that I'm at, you know, in some of those areas and some of the backgrounds that you're talking about, man. And so when you guys provide that supportive atmosphere, you know, that unconditional love for who they are, man, that unleashes the beast, man. I love that. I love that both of you guys have that as a major, you know, concept in what you guys are doing.
Well, I love this panel. I just want to share the love here because this is a wonderful panel. Every single one of the panelists have touched on facilitating versus top-down learning or top-down teaching. And I was wondering if you guys would like to talk about the differences in the role between, you know, a traditional teacher and somebody who facilitates a child's learning.
You know, that's a great question, and I've been at different places with regard to that over my time in public ed. I probably would maybe like to rephrase it a tiny bit or say it maybe a little bit differently, because what we're finding in our school is that many of our teachers do provide have a great facilitative style in the classroom, and it does generate some really provocative questions, and it allows for students to enter into the learning. You know, but in building an alternative ed school and or making one of these programs thrive, sometimes there's a conflict between you know, running the classroom as we just described it in this student-centered model, but operating with a little bit more, you know, sometimes it's not as democratic. And so sometimes there can be some conflict in terms of how things operate philosophically. And I just think that that's, you know, sometimes the complexity of having to create these programs that, you know, that are oftentimes ones that we have to fight for and create, right? But I think we all mentioned earlier that money and resources are such a critical part of this. So anyhow, I'm just saying that there's sometimes the dynamic where, and this is true with some of the boys that I work with. You know, there are times when we create a really democratic space. Today, in fact, I was getting ready to leave the school, and a kid ran up to me on the way out and said, "Hey, Victor, I want to talk to you. We want to start a boxing club after school." And I kept saying, "Okay, yeah." And he kept pressing me on it and saying, no, we got to make it happen. And this is what we want. And he said, we'll even teach it to ourselves. We don't even need another teacher. So he was really persistent about it. So of course, you know, he felt the audacity to bring it forward, knowing that it's going to happen. And so that was a beautiful thing. And that's happened a number of times at our school. But again, there are instances with some kids where, at least for the kids that I work with, there are some times too where we have to be a lot more directive. We have to lead by being role models, and it's not always so democratic, and it sometimes becomes very paternal and or maternal, and we have to sort of guide by the way we live our lives as well. And so I just want to put that out there, because it's not always this coherent, you know, sort of beautiful democratic education or democratic process all the way along. And there are tension-filled moments, and there are disagreements, and there's times when we just need people to make a decision, and you know, and all of those things too. So we try to balance that, and I think that's one of the beautiful things too that we're learning to do on our own.
Yeah, I think that's I get that. I totally get that, coming from the public schools and being in the school environment that I get right now. And one of the things that I've trained a lot of schools around the country, the thing that I get brought in the most for is classroom management training. You know, and I go to Title I schools around the country, and that's what the principals want. You know, so it's an interesting thing. It's that fine line between, you know, do you really want, you know, I'm trying to shift that focus. Are you asking classroom management because you want a way to just put the smack down and learn how to truly manipulate the children into just doing what you want them to do and having them not know which way is up, but they at least obeyed you? Or do you want to start to create a different environment where relationships take place in a different environment where the kids are able to almost manage themselves because they're so excited about what's going on. And then how do you do that? And what does that look like? And it's different from school to school, class to class, kid to kid. And, it's such a large undertaking, but I get that, to try to find that, try to find that balance on how to make that work in that kind of environment is a tough thing. It's a never ending process. But one of the things that I found, at least in those environments, is, a lot of it comes down to site leadership, and it comes down to the teachers that they're hiring, and really kind of where they're coming from, and if they're going to get on board with, what their perspective is as far as that. We want to put the smack down versus, okay, how do we make this work more organically? I totally get that. It's a fun struggle.
Yeah, the other part about it is, at least again, with many of the kids I've worked with in these large urban districts that have been in traditional schools for so long, is that unfortunately, very simple things like communication, facilitation, listening, these are skills they need to learn also. And so these are things that have to be taught very deliberately, at least the kids that we're working with. So while we strive for those spaces, and we call ourselves a project-based learning school, we still have to kind of reteach some of these very basic skills. Something like listening that seems so obvious. We're really intentional about how we teach that in certain spaces, so that differences of opinions and points of views and ways of being iterative can really be something that's embraced and learned from one another. But that requires, some of the protocols we use in our own administrative meetings, we use in the classrooms around communication. So unfortunately, when we get kids, by the time they're in sixth grade, they have years of experience of just being told to be quiet and sit in their chair. So again, I think it's a beautiful concept around a democratic classroom and working with the issues that are important to them, but getting them to be in conversation about it and to really be able to make a space to hear one another, that in and of itself requires some skill building that we have to be very intentional about.
Yeah, I would, I think what Victor said a little minute or two ago about modeling is huge. For us, one of our kind of like, what we call agile roots. We have 4 or 5 of them. And one of them is really what we kind of summarize by saying the medium is the message. Or the longer version is that, people learn more from the experiences that they have than from the content that they're taught. And so in terms of facilitation, a lot of it is, if you're trying to tell a kid like, hey, you can create whatever life you want, or you're the author of your narrative and you're in the driver's seat, they actually need to feel that that's the experience, and so finding ways to actually create an organization, a school, however, whatever your thing is, finding ways to actually make it, experientially, so that the kids recognize and are connected to being co-creators of it, whether it's having a way for them to manage, partially manage the finances of the school, or create, cultural agreements within the school, or, any way that you can get them actually doing it. And that's the difference between like faking it and actually doing that, is like, how can you actually create a space where the kids are co-creating the school and are autonomous in it and are connected to what they're doing in a way that isn't just a put on. And I think kids are really good at knowing what's a put on. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of attempts, in progressive education to just like make it look really nice for the adults, and the kids still know that it's a put on. And so for me, it's really about operating, you don't want to limit yourself. I think there are times where teaching is important and useful, and that circles back to the idea of passion. For me, it's appropriate to be teaching when you're passionate about what you're teaching about, because that's the only time people are really going to be paying attention, and people are going to be interested in you, is if you're passionate about the thing you're trying to teach. But other than that, for me, it's really about the kind of paradigm difference between, are you operating from a place of love and trust, or are you operating from a place of judgment and control? And you can be operating from judgment and control and still be really nice and teach and treat people really nice. But behind all that is still, judgment about what's happening and the choices and the decisions of individuals, and trying to gently coerce and control and manipulate the environment. And so I think it's always something, as I'm checking myself on, and facilitators that I work with are always checking themselves on, is this is this love and trust that we're operating from, or are we trying to manipulate and control the environment with a really nice veneer over top of it.
That's really a great question for life, something that you could carry with you and actually model and learn. And actually that leads me into the next question that I want to put to the panel. And thank you, Thomas, and everybody on this panel for sharing so many incredible insights. My question is, really, what is your highest vision for your students when they leave your institution, your school? What is it that you wish for them to leave the school or your programs with a sense of, and then fill in the blank? My panel got very shy all of a sudden. Am I going to have to call on somebody?
I guess I feel like I said it earlier, so I'll just quickly echo it or summarize it. For me, I actually was talking to someone about this today who was visiting the school, who's in part of a startup group of people trying to start a school in New Orleans, I believe, and they're looking at democratic schools and democratic model, and talking about the kind of line from that community is, we live in, if we want people to grow up to live in a democratic society, they need to be practicing democracy. And, it's kind of like, I don't really experience our society as democratic personally. So for me, I think, producing students that, not just practicing parliament, because that's kind of a show that doesn't actually exist for us, but actually having the skills and the self concept, the confidence in yourself, the ability to ask for help when you need it, the ability to find the resources you want when you need them, the ability to communicate and connect people and things and ideas to produce, to build the system or build the community or build the invention or build, the thing that you want in your life that's actually gonna create change. I think having those skills is what I'm hoping to create in terms of preparation. But on top of that, I'm really mostly just interested in having kids learn, experiencing life as joy and fun and play and work as play and life as as a journey and experience and an adventure, as much as it is this thing that I have to conquer and master. And so balancing those two things, and I think it's really more focusing on the latter and seeing the former as a positive side effect of that.
Yeah, it's such a grand question, man. It's easy to kind of see it as this kind of esoteric sort of concept of what do we want these kids to have accomplished, or how do we want to send them off. I think a few things for me. One is kind of adaptability. I think I want kids to be that's why one of the things I like about Agile Learning Centers is, I want them to be mentally, emotionally, intellectually agile. I want them to be able to adapt to their environments and to learn and to add value in whatever environment their path takes them. I want them to always be able to have the desire to think for themselves while being loving and open to hearing the opinions of others and being able to dialogue in those kind of communities. And one of the things I always tell my kids is, at the end of the day, I want you to be able to look back at your day and say, okay, how did I make how did I make the day better? How did I make the world a better place for everybody that I came in contact with? What did I do to make it better for them? You know, how did I add value to somebody else? You know, and if they can look back and kind of find a purpose in that, kind of find a way to see where they added value to somebody else's life because they were in it, you know, then you know, I think they're kind of on the right track, and I think adaptability is a big part of that, because, you know, your path's going to take you in so many different directions. So, you know, it's a grand concept to think about, but that's really, you know, that's kind of really what I tell my kids and where I want to lead them.
We talk with our kids often about having the audacity to think big, to think different, to think out of the box, to say the thing that they're feeling and thinking, and to do so with the intent of transforming something that could benefit others, and to do so with a great deal of love and care. Those are things that we talk about explicitly. As I mentioned before, we have our Love Great Action Principles. We have a really cool branding kit, by the way, since we were thrusted out into the branding world with Jungle 8. But we've continued that on with knowing that messaging and who we are, our identity is really important. And I've tried to model that for our young folks. So it's been great over the years to put the kids in situations where they are able to live out these principles before they leave us. Our seniors right now are working on their sort of senior thesis and senior projects, and we have kids coming up with, like, I don't know, these one group of kids are coming up with these biodegradable soccer shin guards that they have actually went and sourced. They were trying to source carbon fiber that they thought they could get to be biodegradable, and then they found that it was actually the adhesive that is bonded within the carbon fiber that is the thing that is least biodegradable. So they've tried to work on finding some germ that could eat the carbon fiber. And so these are all things that I just have learned kind of recently, but that's the sort of audacious idea that we love to talk about with the young folks. And, you know, it's a little on the esoteric side in that it's a soccer shin guard, but for these kids of like whom 100% of them grew up playing soccer, it was the first step in saying, and they saying to themselves and to their community at large, that that's a community I belong to. I can make an impact that was never thought of before, and I want to make a difference. And that's the kind of thing that you've got to feel really proud about as these young people start to leave our schools for the first time. But those are things that we hope that they'll take with them.
Absolutely beautiful. What a joy to meet all of you on this panel and to get you guys all together and sharing your thoughts and ideas and really creating for these 2 hours of community. And I can't believe how quickly the time passed. So we just have time now for everybody to give us their final thoughts. And if you want to share your website or any projects that you're working on or any, talks coming up, go ahead and do that now. And why don't we start off with you, Matt?
Sure. Again, yeah, this has been, time has flown by, man. It's been a pleasure to speak with all of you guys, and I definitely want to stay in contact. And I was in contact a little bit with Thomas prior to, and obviously Lainey and Victor. I love what you're doing as well. So I definitely want to stay in contact with you guys and just support you guys in any way I can. And yeah, so we've got a lot of things going on here in the area. My school, Adventure Christian School, we're developing this school within a school model. I'm also talking with Sam Deffer out of Austin, Texas, and we're going to be opening up an Acton Academy. So you guys look that up too, Acton, ACTON Academy.org. We're going to be opening up an Acton here in Northern California as well, which, founded on many of the principles that we're speaking about today. So those things are coming up, and then I'll be highlighting a lot of these schools in a talk this Friday, speaking at TEDx in Santa Cruz. And so as soon as that link comes up as well, people can follow me on as Education Dude on Twitter, and I'll be posting the link to that as well, and just kind of highlighting some of the various ways people are going about educating kids, and really, kind of believing in the genius of all of us. And that's really kind of the foundation of the talk. So again, there's a shout out to Agile Learning Centers in there. I'll be mentioning, the Acton Academies, the Sudburys, the some of the democratic free schools, and just saying, hey man, take a look. People are doing some amazing things, and it's all because we are amazing people if just given the right support and the right environment. So, and I'm always glad to help out, man, and support anybody that's supporting kids. So anything I can do, man, anybody can always get a hold of me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly sure who the audience for this show is, but I guess I echo a lot of what Matt said, and I would just encourage people who are, considering kind of jumping to a different paradigm that that you can do it, and that there are lots of, like Matt said, there are lots of people there who are doing that, and who are creating alternatives and creating new systems that can replace the old ones. And it's really just important to find a community that feels right to you, and that is doing that work, and be a part of creating those solutions. The more and more people that do that, the more critical mass there is to kind of tip the scales. And that's a huge part of what I'm particularly passionate about around the ALC project, is kind of the facilitator community and the network. And so our summer program is a 4-week residential program for people who want to either start a school or have a school and want to join our network and work and play with us. And it's an incredible transformative time. And so I would definitely, that's my only plug, I guess, would be to check that out. AgileLearningCenters.org. We'll have a front end upgrade this summer, but you can at least find our facilitator webpage from there. And I'm really interested in seeing what the future of teaching and facilitation looks like too, and training people who want to do this work with kids to actually figure out what that looks like together, because you're not going to learn it at Teachers College, and there's really not a whole lot that's been done around that. So I'm pretty stoked about that frontier that lies ahead.
Thank you, Laney, for including me in this conversation, and Matt and Thomas, thank you for your work. I think the only thing I'd like to add, and it's a little bit about what both gentlemen have said. I think it's really important, maybe speaking to the adults that do this work, teachers, community leaders, founders of organizations, those wanting to start alternative programs, is just continue to reach out and connect with people that are doing work, hopefully in communities that are a little dissimilar to yours. Reach out to folks that maybe on the surface seem like they're serving a different population and or may have a different sort of angle on the work. But I think Matt said it earlier, there are a lot of underlying themes that we can connect around. And most importantly, I know that the kids in these programs, no matter how disparate they are, it's so beautiful to watch them get down and vibe together when they come from such disparate communities. And I think that re-solidifies the work that we're doing and the importance of it. So I'm here and would love to reach out with folks and connect kids from our school to others, to those in other schools. This technology shows that it's possible and relatively inexpensive and easy. So I think above and beyond everything else that we've said, anything that we can do to keep connecting kids and opening up that universe, I'm all for that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you, Victor. Thank you. This has been an incredible panel. Links to everybody's projects are on the show notes page, so I urge everybody to take a look at that. You can find that at consciousconsumernetwork.tv, and just follow the links to all of their projects. But before we sign out, I want to give you a quick preview as to what's happening in next week's show. Many believe indigo children are here on our planet now as a new wave of consciousness moves humanity closer to our true potential. Many believe that the true potential is found through our consciousness, both in waking and sleeping states. And many believe true indigos travel comfortably between these worlds and are here to remind us how to do so. And many believe that these indigo children are indeed special, often have abilities, and along have special needs. But what of educating them? Next week, we have a panel of guests who work with this unique group of children and have very specific thoughts on education as a whole. Join us Monday, April 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific on the Conscious Consumer Network for this very special conversation. And as always, I want to thank you, our producer, Nina. You're always working so diligently behind the scenes, and I couldn't do this every week without your help. So thank you so much, Nina. And thank you to everybody at the network, Mel Biggie and the Conscious Consumer Network, for giving us this opportunity to highlight beautiful voices and opinions and experiences like we've had tonight on our panel. I think it's very important. I think what Victor said was, let's just keep connecting and keep the conversation going, because this is a very important topic. I've learned so much from everybody on the panel tonight. So that's it. We're out. Wherever you are, whatever you do, continue to always do it for the love of learning.